welcome to Soft Cover. Today we are speaking to Siddarth Shrikanth, author of The Case for Nature, The Other Planetary Crisis. This is the book that we are talking about today. This Penguin publication is an optimistic book about how the case for nature can be made by giving or seeing economic value in the ecological services that nature provides to us, which have historically been ignored. Siddarth Shrikanth lives in London and works in climate and nature investing. He's gained a joint MPA and MBA from the Harvard Kennedy School and Stanford's Graduate School of Business, during which he co-founded a natural carbon removal startup and consulted for the World Bank on environmental policy. Welcome to Soft Cover.
Thank you for having me.
So, one of the most central sort of arguments that the book makes is that of natural capital. You say that we should create a framework that would assign essentially, I mean, you float with various ideas and explore different things that people are doing, but essentially the basic premise is to kind of assign economic value to services that have been overlooked and that nature does provide us. So why do you think that this particular framing is the right way to go? And do you think that it kind of does risk excluding certain services that we may not be able to assign economic value to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think the baseline of the natural capital approach is that, in of itself, nature is priceless, but that it doesn't mean nature doesn't have value. And so we can hold both those ideas in our minds. On one hand, I think it's really, really important to remember that any of these economic frameworks will only ever capture a small sliver of the value that nature has. But it's fine to begin to expand that range of value because what we do currently does price nature. If we think about how our modern economy interacts with natural ecosystems, we do price nature, right? We say a tree is worth more dead than alive, and we use nature for extractive services. So what natural capital does is it says, there are other services like carbon storage and pollination and nutrient cycling and soil health, things that human societies really do rely on for their well-being. It's worth beginning to value those services as well, on top of just the food commodity production or timber production that nature currently provides. But I totally agree. I think one of the big reflections for me was we need to also make sure we recognize the intrinsic moral, spiritual case for nature, because this isn't just about economics. And so I devote the back half of the book to exploring some of those ideas as well.
So, frameworks for nature conservation, for the preservation of nature have existed before, and we do have global treaties that kind of work towards that. How can we ensure that a framework for nature capital and the kind that you kind of propose can be better monitored and don't sort of fall to the wayside as many others have?
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing to say is there are treaties that exist, but some people don't realize that some people may have heard of the climate COP, the Conference of Parties that happens every year in different cities. There's a nature COP as well. And so actually the two began exactly the same time in Rio in 1985. Now, one set of COPs, the climate COPs, we've seen significant success and some setbacks, but at least it's got through to the general public. So we know when COP27 is happening, for example. The same hasn't happened with the nature COPs, right? They've kind of limped on. The agreements have been, frankly, they haven't had much effect. And there has been a major treaty agreed in Montreal last December at COP15, but the proof is in the pudding in how we implement it. So I think the first thing to say is even those international agreements around nature that we currently have been very poorly enforced. We missed all of the targets we set for ourselves in Aichi, and so part of it is just meeting the targets we have set for ourselves and using the frameworks we do have right now. But I think part of what the thinking I lay out in this book, to begin with, doesn't necessarily require policy action. I think in the long term, what we need is significantly more policy action. But part of what I try to do is find cases from across the world of entrepreneurs, local communities, city governments, national governments, who are just getting on and doing it, right, with the frameworks we currently have in place and getting both short-term and long-term value for their people through protecting and restoring nature. So the first thing I'd say is, improving these cases and scaling them up can actually have a really big impact now, even in the absence of a kind of grand global policy on valuing natural capital. But that will come, and it's beginning to happen, and it's a really, really important long-term trend.
What are some of the challenges involved in kind of valuing that natural capital that you kind of came across while writing this book?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest things is, with climate change, we have a really simple metric for how we measure it, where we have tons of carbon. And we can, to be fair, that was agreed on using a number of calculations and comparing different greenhouse gases, but we at least have one number. And so it's very easy in some ways to measure and monitor that, despite all the challenges. With nature, it's less straightforward, right? There's lots of different species on this planet, some big, some small. You've got plants, you've got animals, you've got microbes that you can't even see. Species diversity is notoriously hard to measure because we only ever capture a small slice of the diversity that exists. And then there's a question of how do you trade off different species if you are doing that, right? Like, is an eagle worth more than a beaver and whatever else? And I think my reflection on all of that was, what we need, we will never understand the full extent of ecology and ecosystem complexity, but we're making significant strides in doing that. So one of the cases I highlight in the book is an example of a great company based here in the UK that takes small samples of environmental DNA, which is basically fragments of DNA that all living beings, plants and animals, and microbes leave in the soil or in the water around them. And you can essentially take a small sample, sequence it in a lab, and then figure out what's in the soil sample. So I did that for the book, and actually throws up hundreds of thousands of species that we just, before this technology existed, and it's very low cost for what it does, we would never be able to do that. We'd have to send people into the field to physically measure trees or count birds. That still needs to happen, but one of the big tailwinds, I think, for the sector is we have technology now that can help us measure and monitor biodiversity to a much greater extent.
How can monitoring biodiversity how does that play into this framework that you propose?
Yeah, I mean, the fundamental logic there is you can only manage what you measure, right? And so if you want to optimize for ecosystem restoration and protection, it's helpful to understand whether it's working and what the effects are. And if you want to build markets around something, then you have to pay for outcomes. One of the big failings, I think, of the last several decades is we've paid for practices. So we say, farmers should do this. You should plant cover crops, or you should have kind of farm boundaries that are more biodiverse. We have no idea whether that actually works or doesn't work in a given context, right? And the more we can transition to actually paying people for outcomes in terms of biodiversity uplift, we can then create markets that actually work. And so, if what we're aiming for is a healthier ecosystem, we don't need to measure every aspect of it, but we can pick a few that are important, like carbon storage, species diversity, a couple of others. And we can track those over time and say, okay, things are heading in the right direction. There's value being created. We can monetize some of that value and pay it back to communities that need it. So I think monitoring is at the heart of making some of these cases for nature credible.
So, every study out there also says that the finance for this, for the preservation and conservation of nature is severely underfunded. It's not where it needs to be. Even in the climate space, funds for adaptation are a fraction of what they are for mitigation, which is seen as profitable. So, and you dedicate a chapter in the book to how nature can be financed. So what are some ways in which they can be?
I mean, there's never enough money, right, with any of these good things. And I think the first thing I reflected on was there is money going to nature on the order of 125 billion a year. The vast majority of that money today is from public budgets. So it's governments typically spending on their domestic economies for conservation. Now, if you compare that to the amount of money that goes into harmful subsidies for agriculture and fishing, it's enormous. It's kind of 4 or 5 times that number I just quoted. So the first thing to recognize is there is a lot of money being spent that influences nature. The problem is most of that actually harms nature by subsidizing harmful practices. And the first place I think money can come from is reshaping those subsidies. So taking what we currently subsidize and instead paying for ecological outcomes could unlock hundreds of billions of dollars across the world. of not new money, but existing money just used differently. I think that's number one. There are lots of private sources of capital that beginning to flow into in nature conservation and restoration. I think there's lots of opportunity to scale that up, both from companies and from private investors. But in the early days of some of these markets, I think smart philanthropy can do a really important job of proving that these cases exist and helping them scale up to the point where they can receive commercial investment. So in some ways, everything matters, right? We need public money. We absolutely need more of it. We need to reshape how we currently spend it. We can bring more private capital in, and there are sources of capital beginning to flow with new structures. And philanthropic money and aid money is actually a really, really important way of de-risking some of these ideas before they become commercial.
Okay. As I was reading the book, it did kind of strike me that a lot of the solutions and a lot of the technology, a lot of those kinds of innovations that the book focuses on are coming a lot from the global north, less so from the global south. I was kind of interested in how you chose to structure the book and what kinds of innovations struck you and that you chose to sort of feature.
Yeah, and I actually disagree. I think I tried very hard to say, let's not fall into the trap of highlighting global north solutions. So for example, in the technology chapter, I highlight the case of a really amazing Maasai-led initiative to measure and value ecosystems in the Masai Mara. And I think it's a really interesting case of, you think of tech and you think maybe Silicon Valley, but actually this is an amazing case of using LiDAR, bioacoustics, a number of other technologies to really measure ecosystems with amazing precision, and they're based in Kenya. In the tech chapter, again, I mentioned a project called Project Vani based in India that uses bioacoustics. So essentially listening to the sounds of nature and using that, bird song or insect sounds to measure species diversity and health. In the ecotourism chapter, I go to Fiji, which is really the end of the earth. It's a developing country that isn't on anyone's radar, but they're doing some amazing work on creating an ecotourism economy that I think can restore ecosystems in that country and give the people who live there a real livelihood. So, there's a real mix of cases in there, but there's almost a balance of cases that's tilted towards the global south because I think there are enough books to highlight global north solutions. Okay.
And, as I was reading the book, I mean, it's written in a way that is easy to read. It kind of invites a range of people to kind of explore the kind of topics that you bring. So when you were writing it, who did you have in mind? Also because the book kind of avoids prescribing any kinds of solutions or actions. You do have a chapter at the end, a sort of synthesis that brings together everything you've presented. So who did you have in mind while writing this book, and what was your approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the idea of natural capital is not something I invented, to be clear. This idea has been around for a long time, and it's mostly been in the academic world. And there are some amazing books, I should acknowledge, that I've read that are academic in nature and explain some of these concepts. I think I set out to write a book that was aimed at a general audience. So taking some of those ideas, marrying them with actual cases from the ground, which have actually popped up over the last few years. And telling those stories to people who may not be aware of either of these two worlds, the kind of finance and tech and investment world, or the academic science of natural capital and so on. So yeah, I really was thinking anyone who's curious about environmental issues, who may have read a little bit about climate change and is interested, and hasn't yet fully understood the biodiversity crisis, which I argue is just as important and just as urgent, and linked to the climate crisis. So yeah, I mean, it was aimed at a general audience. I think what I tried to do is take a storytelling approach. These are not my stories; these are stories of people from across the world who are making it happen. But it's been an amazing journey to try and translate some of that to something that hopefully anyone can pick up. And towards the end, I do offer. You're right. It's kind of a synthesis of the argument of the book. And where I end on is you can do a lot. You can do a lot in your personal lives. You can do a lot in your professional lives. And one of the ideas I was wrestling with is the most important, most valuable asset you have in some ways is your time and how you choose to spend your time. And regardless of whether it's a professional or personal life, there are things you can do to make the case for nature, and we can walk through that if it's helpful. But I really would encourage everyone to at least reflect on the role nature plays in their lives, and try and support some of these efforts wherever they are in the world.
All right, thank you so much for your time and for this book. Thanks for everybody watching. Do subscribe to ThePrint on YouTube if you like this video and want to see more.
Thank you.